Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Trumos, Perek Aleph, Halacha Dalid, and God willing, starting Halacha Hey. We're going to learn today Daf Yud Beis. We left off on Daf Yud Beis, Amid Aleph, all the way on top of the Amid, beginning with the new Halacha. Now, Halacha Dalid is contrasting the opening Halacha Aleph. So in the first Mishnah, we opened the Masechta with the Chamisha Lo Yitroimu, and more than that, V'im Tarmu Ein Trumas and Truma. Now we're going to learn about a list of another 5, and those are the Ilaim, the Shikir, the Arum, the Suma, and the Balkari, as we'll learn them inside, even though Lechatchila, they should not be separating Truma, as the Gemara will give the reasons for each one why. Nevertheless, if any one of the 5 did separate Truma, by them we say that yes, Truma san Truma. That will be the first part of Halacha Dalid. The second part of Halacha Dalid will be the rule that Truma must be taken only by estimation and not the way Meiser is removed, which is by the exactitude of 10%, 10% whether it's an item that normally is transacted with the midah, then it's 10% of the midah, or the minyan, or the mishkal. We don't have that by truma at all. The Gemara, after giving the reasons for all of the 5, really there are 2 reasons that cover all of these 5, the ilim, the shikir, the aram, the suma, and the balkari. We're going to have a sugya today, a little bit about shikrus, about being intoxicated. Really in halacha, there are 3 levels to being intoxicated. We're speaking here about getting intoxicated by drinking a beverage, by drinking wine. One level, the lowest level, is called a shasui. More than a shasui is called a shikir. Our sugya will be about the shikir. Even more than the shikir is someone that Chazal referred to who reached the level of shikrusay shaloit. As we have in the Chumash, the story that Loit became so intoxicated that he had a relation with his daughters and he was not aware of it, or becoming shikir, blacking out. That's called shikrusei shaloit. That will not be the topic of our sugya. We're going to be learning about the shikir, and really we're going to be speaking about davening. We're going to be speaking about making birchas hamazon. We're going to be speaking a lot about reciting the Shema. While one is in that place of being shikir, you have to appreciate that it was not uncommon for people to drink while they were eating. So as we will see, that benching will be the least problematic. On the other hand, standing Shmoyne Esrei while one is intoxicated is the most problematic. And regarding reciting the Shema, you're not standing in front of the king, but you're concentrating and you're declaring the principles of Jewish faith. We're going to have a big discussion about whether a shikur, someone who's intoxicated, whether he or she may or may not say the Shema. And really from there, we're going to bridge over to someone who's unclothed. Also, whether if someone is unclothed, whether they are or not allowed to recite the Shema. This will be more or less the first topic, Halacha Dalet. Halacha Hey, which will be the Mishnah on Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis, the Mishnah will begin today, the Mishnah. We won't be able to conclude the Mishnah. We're going to learn about a case where midda oiraisa, an item was properly tithed, so an item will be mesukan. Nevertheless, as we will see, that only on a rabbinic level does it again have to have a truma removed from it. We're going to have to figure out how that works. This is more or less a synopsis of today's daf. And without any further ado, we would like to welcome Dr. Bobby, who's joining us today. We are starting Chavra Daf Yud Beis Aviv, Daf Yud Beis Amud Aleph, all the way on top by the Mishnah. So again, in contrast, right, the Rabbeinu HaKadosh was very symmetrical in the way he wrote things. Here he writes that there is another 5 categories of people, Chamisha Lo Yitremu, that they should not remove Truma. However, unlike Halacha Aleph, here we say V'im Tarmu, but if they remove the Truma, Trumas and Truma, their separation is valid. Who are these 5? Ilaim, a mute person, mute meaning someone who is able to hear. And as we learned in the previous topics, in the previous sugya, that hearing is what allows someone's mind to develop. So a person who is able to hear, their limitation is only they're unable to speak. They are halachically considered to be fully mentally competent. So the problem is, So what if they can't speak? We'll see in the Gemara each one. We already know they have to make a bracha. We'll get to that in the Gemara. The next one is a shikr, a drunken person. And again, like we mentioned, there's 3 levels of drunkenness. Shasui, shikr, shikrusei shaloit. We'll see which one we are talking about over here. Third category is someone who is arroim, someone who's unclothed, completely unclothed. Someone's private parts are exposed. Again, we'll see in the Gemara the issue with each of these. Summa is a blind person. And the fifth is a balkeri, someone who experienced a seminal emission. And again, let's address each one in the Gemara. These are the 5. And the Mishnah repeats, lo yitroimu. The Mishnah repeats it because when you hear that these 5, if post facto what they did, it's done, people might not take it seriously. Doesn't matter. They can do it. So Rabbi writes twice, they don't do it. In other words, we give a lot of reverence to lechatchila. Better not. Even though once you did it, still better not. But the im tarmu, but if they separated truma, any one of these 5, trumas and truma, their separation will be effective. Topic number 2 in the Mishnah. And Chavra, we already made mention of this last week. That ein toirmen, one should not separate truma, loy b'midam, not by measure, v'loy b'mishkol, not by weight, v'loy b'minyan, not by count. Different items are transacted with different ways, right? Many people buy eggs by the dozen. That's by a number. Certain things are sold by the pound. Certain things are sold by measure. Whichever way something is transacted with, unlike Maisid, like we said, the Mishnah says, Al tarbela aser umadois. Don't give Maisid by approximation. Maisid you give by exact. Truma, in contrast, should not be given by exact. Has to be given by estimation. Okay, and again, what percent are we given? Again, biblically, there isn't a minimum amount. The Chachamim suggested 3 options, one of 60, one of 50, one of 40. We're going to speak about the medium, the one of 50, which is what we call 2%. So the 2% must be separated by estimation. Avol, however, toirim hu esa madud ve'esa shakul ve'esa manoi. You separate truma from something that was measured or weighted or counted. That's very important. In other words, the truma should be removed by estimation. But that does not mean that the pile from which you are removing truma should not be measured. Actually, we're going to get into that more when we learn the Gemara. But on one hand, this is one of the many paradoxes that we have to deal with. It's very important not to run our lives by estimation. Estimation is a defense mechanism for many lazy people. Yeah, more or less. No, more or less. What was it? What is it? What it will be? You run a business, you have to know accounts receivables, accounts payables. Don't do by estimation. You'll get into a lot of trouble. On the other hand, we know that there's a certain blessing that God gives into that which is not counted. So when you begin, you have to begin by exactitude. You're beginning to separate maasros from what? From the harvest. How much do you have? How many pounds do you have? That you measure. But the separation of the truma should be done by estimation. A lot more than in the Gemara. Now, one may not separate truma using a basket or a box that have a known measure. In other words, even if the container was not designated as a measuring container, I'm not talking about that. Mishnah already says you don't give it by measure, by estimation. But what happens if I have a basket? The basket is not a measuring basket. I happen to know the measure of the basket. So I should not use that basket. Because in my mind, that's a measuring basket. But I could use that basket if I'm going to be filling it up to half or to a third. Because we're not speaking about a basket or a measuring container that has the lines that we have today. The half is estimation. So even though I know this basket contains, I don't know, the quantity, whatever the quantity is. But if I'm going to fill up half of the basket, I'm not going to get it exact on half. So that's called an estimation. We also don't want for the estimation to be completely off. That's a perfect way of doing it. Another law, lo yitraim bisa'ah chetzia, don't separate truma using half the volume of a saw container, shechetzia mida, because a half of saw container is a precise measure. What the Mishnah is referring to, according to the Marafulda, is that the saw container in the times of Chazal, many of them used to have a marker in middle. Many of them. So even if yours doesn't, a saw would be like a liter. It's a certain measurement in the times of Chazal. So we just said that if you have a basket, or even if you have a measuring container, it's a measuring container. This is exactly 1 liter. But if you don't have demarcations, if there's no markings in middle, then you can use it to give half of it. He says in the times of the Mishnah, the saw containers, so many of them had in the middle of them the line or the indentation or the protrusion, however they made those utensils. Even if yours doesn't, maratayin. If I'm going to see you using half of your saw container, I might think that yours has the line. And I'm going to learn from you that you could give truma by exactitude when we have to give it by estimation. Okay, so we had the Mishnah. Really, it's a simple Mishnah. Mishnah is divided into 2 parts. The Gemara begins by going back to the first part of the Mishnah. The Mishnah gave the 5 categories of people that should not separate truma lechatchila. And even though it's amazing, the Gemara is going to give 2 reasons for the 5. They don't follow the order of the Mishnah. So the 5 again, Yaron, is a mute person, cannot, a drunken person, a blind person, a naked person, and a person who had a seminal emission, obviously before they went to the mikveh. They cannot separate truma. From all of the 5, there's only 2 reasons under all of the 5. Yesh mehen mipnei bracha, says the Gemara. Some of them should not separate truma because there is an issue with them reciting the blessing in the state that they are in. And we already learned about this last week. When it comes to almost all the mitzvahs, prior to the mitzvah, midrabanan, you have to make a bracha. I'm saying almost all the mitzvahs. I'll give you an example of a mitzvah prior to which you don't make a bracha. Who can give me an example? What mitzvah do we do that we don't make a bracha before? Giving tzedakah. I once heard the Rebbe with a smile saying, why do you make a bracha? And there's many reasons that we have in the earlier commentators. The Rebbe says, imagine there's a poor man, he needs food. But you're a chassidish guy. For you to make a bracha, you have to go to the mikveh. Then you got to put in your gartel. By the time you made the bracha, the guy died from hunger. If someone needs help, you help them right away. Don't make no brachas. But there's many other reasons for that. One reason is because any mitzvah that is not that doesn't have a limit, you can't make a bracha on. Versus almost all the mitzvahs that there's a beginning, that there's a middle, and there's an end. Tzedakah you give the whole time. But let's go to tefillin. We put on tefillin. If a person forgot to make the bracha, you got the mitzvah of tefillin 100%. But you did not get the mitzvah of making a bracha before tefillin. That you lost 100%. And ideally, when you do a mitzvah, do the mitzvah and get the mitzvah of making a bracha before the mitzvah. And some of the people in the Mishnah, as the Gemara will tell you which one is which, the issue is they can't make a bracha in the state that they are in, the yesh mehen. And another reason behind others of the 5 or some of the 5, because they will be unable to separate truma from the choicest produce. So when you have the 100 apples example that we keep on using, even though I can give 2 of the 100, that's more or less 2%. I'm saying more or less because something, I know when I buy apples in the market here, it's by weight. Many times, the apples, but the few times that I buy apples, when I give 2, it might not be exactly 2% of the weight. Could be the other 98 average way more than the ones that I gave. That's perfect for truma.
Exactly.
We don't want it to be exact, so it's perfect. In other words, we want it to be by estimation. But what we do want is that I should separate the best apples, not leave for me the best and give to the kohen the average or the worst. Some of the 5, because of the state that they are in, like the blind, can't see. Well, the Gemara will say which ones. The reason why lechatchila they should not separate truma is because they are unable to fulfill the ideal of giving from the choicest. And let's go. Which ones are which? And again, it's not in the order of the Mishnah. Ho'ilaim, the mute, and the oraim, the unclothed, and the person who has a seminal emission. The reason why lechatchila they should not separate truma, which one of the 2 reasons applies to them? It's simple. Mipnei bracha, because they are unable to make a bracha. And just on the side that even though we learned this in Bavli, we learned this in the Yerushalmi, that at some later point, we realized that people did not accept the enactment of Ezra, which was that prior to making a bracha, prior to praying, prior to the reciting of the Shema, if a person had a seminal emission, a married man, he has to go to the mikvah. At some later point, nowadays, we are not bound by that. Today, a man who is a Balkeri davens, say the Shema, they make brachas, but in the times of the Mishnah, even though the Mishnah Ezra was in the beginning of the Second Temple, the Mishnah was redacted like 180 years after the 100 years after the Churban Habayis, 110 years after the temple was destroyed, but still at that time people were keeping Ezra's enactment. So if a person had a seminal emission, they're not allowed to make a bracha, and they wouldn't make a bracha; they would just make a separation. But we don't want to have truma separated without the bracha prior. The bracha is asher kedishanu b'mitzvayis v'tzivanu lahafresh truma. That's the bracha that we make when we separate truma. We do this nowadays in the Holy Land. Now the other of the five, which is the blind and the shikir, the blind and the drunken person, why can they not separate truma? For the other reason. The blind cannot see, he cannot take from the choicest, and the shikir, he can see, but even though he sees, he doesn't see, he's shikir. Something that's ugly might look beautiful for the drunken person, and vice versa. And the Torah says, when it comes to truma, these are the words in the Torah always, mikol chelboy, even though chelev normally means fats, but many times the Torah uses the words chelboy as a reference to the choicest part of any given item. Like fat, not in today's society, in real society, that fat is considered great. The greatest people that I know are, have a couple of pounds extra. That's great. That's a sign of greatness and of wealth. In those days, if you had a few pounds extra, that was good. That means you're making a living. All right, l'chaim. Let's go right. No, the deaf mute we learned in the first Mishnah, even post facto, was not good because they're not mentally developed. And now let's dive a little bit into the topic of drunkenness. And again, guys, there are three levels of drunkenness, as the Gemara will define. Really, there are many substances that a person should not, but if they were to ingest, their mind would be altered. All of them fall under the umbrella of drunkenness, but we are focusing here about drunkenness that comes from drinking a beverage, and we're speaking about wine. Then we have to know how to apply the same rules to others. There are three levels of drunkenness. Shasui, the word shasui means someone who drank. Shasui is a word that's used when someone is minimally altered. Worse than the shasui is a shikir, and worse than the shikir is someone who shikir like Loit. And Loit was the man who had a relation with his daughter and didn't even know. Not he didn't know later. He didn't know during, even though Rashi writes that later, when he woke up in the first morning, he knew something really wrong happened the night prior. But while a blackout, I would call it a blackout. I want to say, the Gemara doesn't speak here about someone who's shikr like Loit. Someone who's shikr like Loit is completely exempt from keeping the commandments because they are considered people that have no control over themselves. And actually, the reason why someone halachically is not allowed to get drunk to that level is because I am not allowed to exempt myself from my obligation. It's like the way out. That's the halachic issue. And that obviously doesn't apply only to getting drunk on wine, even though the Gemara will give quantities. The quantities is about the wine in the Talmudic times, but we have to know how to apply it nowadays. That's ma'asr. But we're not talking about someone who becomes shikir like Loit. We're speaking either about someone who drank a little bit. Don't forget, in those days, every time you had a meal, we make kiddush on Shabbos. You make birchat hamazon, you make wine. We're shasui. And then there's shikir. And we have to know how to define which one is which. The Gemara is going to be beautiful. So like this. Abba bar Rav Huna says like following. Shasui, if someone only drank the smallest amount, as we'll see what that means, already al yispalo, should not daven. It's not respectful to stand in prayer. But if he davened, tfilosei tachnunim, his prayer is counted as a supplication, which means that his prayer is valid. He fulfilled his obligation, which means that even after his level of intoxication evaporated, went away, he doesn't have to repeat the Shemona Esrei. He fulfilled his obligation. He shouldn't have, but he did it good. However, a shikir, if you are more drunk, you're already in the category of a shikir. Not only al yispalel, not only should you not pray lechatchila, but ve'im ispalel, but if you daven tfilosoi gidufim, very strong word. Your prayer is blasphemous, or your prayer is an abomination. In other words, not only when the shikir went away, must you repeat the Shemona Esrei? What you did not count, but you have to do tshuva for davening in that state, because it's completely disrespectful. Don't forget that prayer is standing in front of God. The truth is, God, we are always standing in front of God. I know that, but that's from God's perspective. In my perspective, that's not where my mind is at. At least when I daven, my kavanah is now I am getting into the mindset where that God is here and I'm talking to God. If you're talking to God, don't talk to God when you're drunk.
Rabbi, so what's the practical difference in terms of volume between shasui and shikar?
The mother will say in a moment, Vlad. Very good. It's very important. What were you saying? You're asking whether they never had Simchas Torah. 1 second. Wait. We'll get there. Now the Gemara is asking, Vlad, for you. Eis is a shasui. How do you define shasui? So shasui is kol sheshasa revius, someone who drank a revius of wine. Revius, there's a whole debate. How much is a revius? But a revius is a quarter of a loig. A loig is, there's 12 loigs make a hin. These are biblical measurements. Let's go that a revius is approximately 3 ounces. That's where we put the revius at. And it's amazing. Not shasi means you did not drink less than that. And people can argue, doesn't it have to do with the person's tolerance, the person's size? We're not going to get into this right now. Let's begin with the Talmudic definitions. Shasi means someone drank a revius, not less, not more. Shikir, shesasa yoisid, he drank a little bit more than a revius. Now people ask, the valid question, that's how they defined it in the Yerushalmi. That means in Israel, in the Holy Land. Yeah, what about me? What about me? I became so desensitized that that I can drink a revius, it does nothing to me, or I can drink more and I'm not a shikir. So Talmud Amri in Bavel, they gave another definition. And there in Bavel, they did not accept about the quantity because every person is different. They focused on the effect. If you drink if you are unable to properly speak before a king, then you are a shikir. In Bavel, they said that if a person drank more than a revius, so they drank, they're shasui, but they are able to function 100%, defined by that if the king would be here, I would not hesitate to speak in front of him. And we all know that at some point when you drink, your speech either slurs, or people, that's me, you speak too loud, you don't notice it, you begin speaking loud. Your speech becomes altered. The moment your speech became altered, you're the shikir.
It's a very Russian measure, by the way. I just looked it up. 100 gram.
100 gram is like 80 revius.
In Russia,
4 bottles of
Russia, you give you a drink, 100 grams.
Okay, hustle. Now, Rabbi Zajac asked in front of Rabbi Isi, okay, davening is we are the most sensitive when it comes to prayer. So Isaac asked, what about Simchas Torah? Perfect answer. We daven Shemona Esrei, and then we make a l'chaim. And by Shachris, we daven Shemona Esrei, and then we go Hakafas. After Shemona Esrei. We do Hakafas before Musaf, come to Chabad Sola. It's the longest day of the year. It's more than Yom Kippur. From the time we do Hakafas until when we daven Musaf, it's 18 hours. We dance and by then you're already danced off the l'chaim. Now the question is, on the other side, see, there's Shemona Esrei is the worst if you're drunk. The other side is making birchas hamazon.
One opinion is that you can drink minimum revius, like Talmud Bavli.
No, Talmud Bavli is that as long as you can perfectly speak, you're not a shikar yet.
So 18 hours would be helpful. But what about?
Okay, let's go right there. Shikar ma'oshi yivarech. Now let's go. Can a shikar make birchas hamazon? Even though you're not allowed to daven, and your davening is an abomination, or it's blasphemous, Amalei. So Rabbi Isi responded to Rabbi Zajac, Since the Torah says ve'ochalta v'savato uveirachta, when you ate hashgacha pratis, that was yesterday's chitas. That's this week's parsha of Ekev. Afilu midumdam. Afilu, even if you drank so much that not that you can't speak in front of a king, can't speak, nothing is coming out. You're silenced. Of course, you're not silenced to the point that you can't bench. Even if your speech was altered, you are allowed to bench because it's common when people eat, they drink wine. That's the way people have a meal. And God says, eat. Torah was given to people. Eat and get satisfied and bench. By benching, there's no problem. There's no problem with being intoxicated. So there's no doubt about that. We're not talking about shikr like loit. There's no problem benching while intoxicated. The question really is, loit tzarcha. No. I knew that about benching. My question was about reading the Shema. Shema is like in between. You're not standing in front of God. Now, guys, today we say the Shema while we're davening. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the Shema that you say before davening. Many people get up in the morning and aside of saying the Birchas HaShachar, they say the Shema. That Shema, you're committing yourself to something in the presence of God, but you're not talking to God the way you talk to God by the Amidah. That's Gavaldik. What about there if a person is drunk? So that's the question. Says the Gemara, Amar Abba Baravin, Chad Chasid Shalol Yozach Alatoiv. By the way, this question was left unanswered. That's what we don't know. But now that we spoke about the reciting of the Shema by Yeshikar that we don't know, so now we're going to quote that there was once a Chassid, and he asked Eliyahu HaNavi. It's amazing how in the Gemara, at times, you have a record of someone talking to Elijah the prophet. But here in the Yerushalmi, to qualify, you got to be a chassid. Then you can talk to Eliyahu Navi. We can all talk to him, but then you can hear him respond back. And he asked him, Aro ma'u sheyikra Shema, can an unclothed person read the Shema? Amalei, Eliyahu Navi responded. And he quoted the pasuk that we have in Parshas Kiseitze. And the pasuk writes, V'lo yira b'cha ervas davar, that God should not see a shameful thing, a ervas davar, amongst you. That's a parsha that's speaking about going out to war, how we should behave properly, how the camp should be holy. But ervas davar is also a remez. Instead of reading the word davar, thing, you can read a dibur, speech. Ervas dibur, which means that while a person is speaking to God, their erva, their nakedness should not be uncovered. We have to have the private parts of the person covered for them to recite the Shema. So that was clear. By the Shikr, we had a doubt. By an Aroim, Eliyahu Navi told us what to do. People ask, how can Eliyahu Navi give any type of halachic ruling when Torah la b'shamayim? So there are a couple approaches to that. Approach number one is that if people down here came to a halachic conclusion, if human beings, Yidden, through using the Yud Gimel Midos, then we don't go to the heavens to hear another opinion. Certainly not. We don't go to the heavens, including Eliyahu Navi, to hear another side. People said here kosher, he's going to say not kosher. But if no one knows the halach over here, no one knows. That might be different. That might be different. Because we don't have a Torah ba'aretz. They're not going against anything that was said on the earth. And that's why you have every time teku. Tishbi yitaretz kushis v'aboyes. That means since we don't know, if we have a doubt, then we do go to the heavens. That's why we have a shailos utshuvas min hashamayim, because the Rav over here did not know what the answers are. There is another very important word of the Chassam Sofer, and he says the following, that Eliyahu HaNavi, unlike most others, everyone's soul lives forever. What's unique about Eliyahu HaNavi is that at time, he comes back here embodied. Now, whose body does he take? I don't know. That's another topic. When do we say Torah is not in the heavens? When he's only, when he's like a malach. So the Eliyahu Navi that comes to your Seder, he doesn't come in a body, not the one that I see. When he comes to a bris, he doesn't come embodied. In that state, he cannot give a halachic opinion. The Torah is not in the heavens. But when he comes back embodied, then he's embodied. Then he could give a halachic opinion. Okay, weiter. Tanech Chizkiyah says the Gemara that even though Eliyahu Navi only addressed the question of reciting the Shema unclothed, now let's speak about the unclothed and benching. Tani Chizkiyah, that really the problem of being uncovered, the problem of having one's nakedness being exposed, isn't only about Shema. Bein likrois, bein levarech. No bracha can be recited when the person is unclothed. Unlike shikir that we just learned, a shikir could make a bracha when you're shikir. So there's a huge difference between the problem of being drunk and the problem of being unclothed vis-a-vis saying a holy word, making declarations of faith, or talking to God. Yes. So there are two issues. Very good. There are two parts of it. B'kitzur. The minimum is to have one's nakedness covered. And then we also find that one's heart should not see one's nakedness, that there should be something separating the heart and the person's private parts without getting into details. For sure, the more clothed, the more respectful. But there's a minimum. So, a person is having a cover on one's body is called clothed. Clothing doesn't have to mean clothing.
What does that mean? Your heart doesn't see your nakedness. What
the
is
heart
that?
doesn't see your nakedness would mean, Vlad, that if a person would be mamish unclothed and they would put their arms between their heart and their nakedness, then some type of covering with that would be for certain areas in halacha that's considered better than being completely unexposed.
Got it.
Mikvah water does not count, and we learned about this in brachas. There's a big difference between a man and a woman when it comes to these halachas physically. That if a woman is sitting, even though she's unclothed, then her private parts are considered covered, and therefore we're going to learn in a Mishnah later about a woman sitting and separating challah, even though she's making a bracha, versus a man. Even when a man sits, the way the physical private parts function, your sitting doesn't help anything. Very good. By Ashkenazim, we make the bracha in the mikvah because, because of the physical body. The waters of the mikvah hopefully are not dirty enough for that to be considered covering. In other words, the reason why when women in the mikvah they go to the mikvah once and then they cover their hearts with their hands, and because of the way they are physically made, the other private part is considered covered, and they have their hair covered. That's the way it should be. The balanit gives the woman a towel to cover the hair, and they make the bracha, and then they go under the water again. Okay, Chavre, moving on, Yud Beis Umid Beis. Now we're going to go through the second topic in the Mishnah about this rule that truma has to be separated dafka by estimation. So says the Mishnah, Ein Tarmin Loy B'Midah. Says the Gemara, Tamon Taninon. We learned over there over here refers to Masechtas Trumais. When you say over there were such great scholars; they knew everything. Over there means in this tractate, in our pagination on Daf Lamed Tes Amud Beis, and the Mishnah writes that Hamoina Meshubach. If you count, noch you're praiseworthy. If you count, V'Hamoided. If you measure, Meshubach Emenu, it's even better. V'Hashoikel, and if you weigh, Meshubach Mishlashnan, it's even greater. We're going to get to that later, even though I keep on mentioning every item according to the way it's transacted with. There in the Mishnah, we're going to get into that. The most precise way of measuring something is by weighing it. Problem is, the Mishnah clearly is saying that it's good to give with precision. And v'cho'at omar kain, and here you're saying that don't give it by precision? Absolutely. Answers the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Our Mishnah is speaking about Truma Gedoyla, which is the first of all of the separations. I know that you have the Bikurim prior. We're talking about once you made the Meiruach, the Truma Sumaisris begins with Truma. The 2% for the coin is called the big Truma, the great Truma. That is what our Mishnah is talking about, only by estimation. The Mishnah on Daf Lamed Tes is speaking about the separation that the Levi gives for the coin. It's also Truma. It's called Truma Smaiser. Truma Smaiser has to be given by precision. As the Torah says, he gives from what he received 10%. Like the Me'eser, Me'eser, Meiser min ha-meiser. That's the difference. Says the Gemara v'tonechein, and indeed, so we clearly see in a Braisa, and here we're learning an opinion that we never yet learned. And this was, who said this? You have in the Yerushalmi Nutanoim, Eliezer ben Goimel. You have over here the Maraful that calls him Eliezer ben Gimel. And the fact that it doesn't say Rebbe, that the greater the people, the less the title. So he must have been a great Tana. Eliezer ben Gimel says, and he quotes the pasuk that we have in Parshas Koirach regarding the Levi separating the 10% for the kohen from his Meiser Rishoin, the nechshav lachem trumaschem. And even though the literal pshat is that God is telling the Levi that even though you don't have land, Therefore, you're not separating from what you grew, but you're giving from what you received. I will reckon it as if. That's the pshat of a nechshav. But there's many drashas that come from the word v'nechshav. The word v'nechshav also means b'machshava atoirim, that you separate. Here, machshava means estimation. I know that in other places, machshava means you don't even have to say it. You just have to think it. Here, machshava means that you separate truma through estimation. Ve'ein atotoirim b'midah b'mishkol u'b'minyan. And more than that, says Eliezer ben Gimel, ma truma gedela b'machshava, af truma smaiser b'machshava. As we learned last week, that we do compare all of the trumais to be the same. All of the trumais means the truma gedela, separated by the farmer, separated by the person who got now the meruach, and the Levi separating truma from his meiser. We compare one to the other. Now, Eliezer ben Gimel says we compare it all the way. All the way means that not only is Truma Gedola given by estimation, but even the Levi's 10% should only be by estimation. That's Eliezer ben Gimel. He's arguing with the consensus, with the Chachamim. So from there, you extrapolate that the Chachamim hold that we do differentiate between Truma Gedola and Truma Smaiser, and that is the resolution to our Mishnah versus the Mishnah on Daf Lametes. Now, says the Gemara V'Hataninon, we learned in our Mishnah writes, we just have to explain these words, that you separate Truma from that which is measured, from that which is weighed, from that which is counted. What does that mean? We already spoke it out in the Mishnah. Amar Rabbi Lazar, Keni Masnisa, the Mishnah is saying good. The Mishnah is saying is that the Tevel, you begin by counting. Moided Adam Estivloi, one, whether he may measure or whether he should measure. At some point, you're going to have to measure to give meiser. You have to measure to give meiser. But you measure your tevel, and then you bring it into your house. In other words, it's not that you never measured. God is not telling you don't measure ever. No, you begin with knowing what you have. But so you remove truma from something that was measured. But the removal of the truma, the separation of the truma, is not done through measure. Similarly, weigh, you are allowed to weigh your tevel, and then you bring it into your house. But when you remove the truma, don't do it through weighing. You are allowed to count your tevel and just to know like this, that we have a pasuk that many of us say every V'yitin L'cha Matzah Shabbos. It's a pasuk in the blessings of Parshas Kisavai for the people who joined the Yerushalmi, just to make it clear that that's the Gabai's Bar Mitzvah Parsha. Everyone knows that in the Bavli. No, Parshas Kisavai, that over there, even though that's not true, there's a lot of brachas there. There's many brachas in Parshas Kisavai. There's a pasuk that says that Yitzav Hashem Itach or Itcha es Itcha es habracha ba'asomecha. Asomecha literally means in your silos, which is where people would store their harvest. That God will command His blessing in your silos. That's the pshat. But the word asomecha is a very unusual word, and in its root, it also has the root of suma. And Chazal say that ein habracha mitzuya, that where does God command His blessing? Only to that which is hidden from the eye. And there we have the paradox. First of all, we never count people, just as an example. Why don't we count people? However you'll understand it, you're limiting. Or sometimes the expression is you're bringing an ayin hara into the people, or you're opening up, you're making the thing or the people vulnerable to a bad eye. As long as it's not known, it's not known. Now again, you have this balance, so I should never count. So you have to know how to count, how not to count. And when it comes to a minyan, we never count verbally. We never count. We have to count animals. That's a great example to give ma'aser behem. I know that. I'm saying you see that there's a paradox between, on one hand, putting your head in the sand by thinking that since I'm not counting, since I don't know how much money I owe today, that's not going to help me. Some people do that. They just don't look. On the other hand, when people count everything, there is a certain limitation that they place on it. This is what I have and not more. And when, you have all these Talmudic stories, how people did not count what they had in the silos. I think there was a big, I forgot, I wish I would remember the name, there was an Amayra or a Tana, that he was such a big tzedakah giver, that people, the Gaboy tzedakah, they did not approach him, because he would give everything away, and he was going to marry off his daughter. And people knew, don't approach him for tzedakah, he'll give away what he needs, the funds. And somehow, someone approached him, and he gave everything he had to someone else. But what stayed in the silo was a couple of kernels that he didn't see. And he knew that he's going to get into trouble at home because he gave everything away. And he went to learn. That was the solution. He went into the Beis Medrash. His wife knew where to find him. But what happened is that the Kala herself, she went to the silo, and the silo was busting at the seams. It means the few little kernels that was left there, somehow, may it happen to all of us and all of you, that the few prutalach that we have in the bank should somehow explode, and you wake up tomorrow morning and you'll have many, many, many more zeros at the end. Okay, weiter. Next Mishnah. Now this is important. Just like today's first Mishnah contrasted Halacha Dalet, contrasted Halacha Aleph, what we are learning now in Halacha Hey, if you remember, what did we learn in Halacha Gimel? The Mishnah was speaking about someone who's separating Truma from olives for the olives and the oil, that whole topic. Now, and what did we say? We said that olives is an unfinished product. We're speaking about olives that were harvested to make oil. You're not supposed to give truma from something that's not yet a completed product. Oil is the completed product. What our Mishnah will explicitly be speaking about, even though we made mention to this in the Gemara, but now we have a Mishnah. What happens if someone separated truma from the oil for the olives? From the oil for the olives. So let's go. Ein toirmin shemen al hazesim hanichtashim. Do not lechatchila. Do not separate from olive oil the 2%. We're not talking about the 2% for the oil. That's great. So if I have 100 liters of olive oil, approximately 2 liters should be. We're talking about a guy added oil to resolve to be the separation for the olives that will be crushed. Don't do that. And the same thing like we had in the previous Mishnah, Halacha Gimel, don't separate wine for the grapes that will be trampled. Yochai woke up. Yayin al anovim hanedrachis. You get the best wine with Yochai. Now, not only should you not do it, and we're going to read this line and we're going to stop over here, but if you did it, v'yachzor v'yitrem, you have to separate truma again. In other words, listen to these words. Even though midoiraisa biblically, when you separated truma from a finished product for its unfinished product, post facto, it's a valid separation. And if it's a valid separation, then it's not tevel, then it's misukan. Once something is misukan, we already learned, you cannot separate truma from something that's mitukan. You can't. You can only separate truma from tevel. The koyach of the chachamim is that rabbinically what you did not fix it, and therefore those olives, when they will be crushed into oil, they have to have from it a new truma separated. As we read, let's read inside the final maraful, then we'll stop with that. The im todam, truma say truma, because the im todam truma, we never had these words yet. If you did it, truma, up until now, whenever Rabbi says, once you did it, that's it, you're good. No, what you did is truma, but do it again. How does that work? So he explains. Nevertheless, when should you separate it again? We're speaking about olives that will be crushed to make oil. Now that you took these grapes and you made them into oil, now that you took the olives into oil, or the grapes into wine, with the trampling of the grapes, and you made them into wine, That's a new thing we never had until now. What you did is effective, but you have to do it again.